Uh, yeah, I'm professor in computer science, have been for almost 30 years, and department chair for the last 6. Last year, however, I was on sabbatical at the Getty, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit, while I take the chance to brag on some of our students. You know that at the University of Kentucky, we have some of the best students in the nation. Stephen Parsons, my graduate student, was recently awarded an NSF graduate fellowship. So happy for him, and he's staying here at University of Kentucky to work on the projects that you'll hear about today. Also, 2 of my students supported by Women in Philanthropy have recently had some great success. Christina Gessel is now a PhD student in our program in the College of Engineering and just won a Best Paper Award at Cultural Heritage and New Technologies. Tough to give a talk like that in an environment where it's remote, but she won the Best Paper Award. We're really proud of her. And likewise, Kira Sievers, a graduating senior, is now a finalist for a Rhodes Scholar, and the selection will be this weekend. So I'm not sure how many are on the webinar, but I know that you all want to see cats go, and because we're all alumni, put in some good thoughts and prayers for Kira this weekend. We want to see if she can win a Rhodes Scholarship. That'd be amazing. My time at the Getty last year was curtailed somewhat by the coronavirus, but it was just spectacular to be able to be at a place where both science and the humanities come together in the form of the Conservation Institute, picture you see on the left, and also in the form of this Getty Villa reproduction, which is an amazing part of the museum that has direct relationship to my work because of the antiquities interest I've had and also the relationship to Herculaneum. So while we were out there, there was actually a show around the explosion in the ancient world of the volcano Vesuvius. And the name of the show was Buried by Vesuvius. And many of the artifacts from Herculaneum, which is the town below at the foot of the volcano, where the Villa of the Papyri was discovered. Many of the artifacts from that village were brought to the Getty, including this statue of the drunken satyr, and one of my personal favorites, a sundial in the shape of a prosciutto ham. I mean, you just don't get that every day, you know, from the ancient world, a prosciutto ham that operates as a sundial. We also had, University of Kentucky actually also had a little bit of involvement in this show at the Getty. And you'll see the acknowledgement here in the Getty Villas exhibition. And you see also the lead curator, Ken Lepatin, giving a tour. And in the left, you see a picture, another version of which you're going to see later in this talk. We actually had a little corner of this exhibit to talk about virtual unwrapping. And in fact, a few of you were able to come out and enjoy the exhibit with me while I was at the Getty and be reminded of the explosion of Vesuvius while we were there, as we were able to see all of those amazing artifacts from Herculaneum. So Herculaneum has played a central role in a lot of the work that I've been doing for a decade or 2 now. And although I'd love to be able to give a retrospective, there isn't going to be enough time in this session to do that. So what I'm going to do is focus in on Herculaneum and some material and the challenges that has brought up for the work that I've done here at the University of Kentucky. What you're seeing here is what the scrolls from Herculaneum look like now. This is an intact papyrus scroll from the ancient world. It's 2,000 years old, and it's carbonized so that it's not possible to unroll. This looms large in my imagination and has become one of the signature things that we're trying to solve in the work that we have pioneered right here at the University of Kentucky, which I call virtual unwrapping. This idea of virtual unwrapping is an idea ultimately that we think can be applied to a wide variety of materials damaged materials that can't be restored or analyzed any other way are perfect candidates for this idea of digital or virtual unwrapping, where we start with some ability to acquire a digital version, and then we move all the way through a set of software operations until we can bring it all together for the purpose of scholarship. So I called this, in a paper we wrote a few years back, an engine for discovery, because basically with this set of steps, starting with a digitization or an acquisition and ending with a way to see inside an ancient artifact, we think that we can discover material that has never been read or seen before since the ancient world. Well, if you reach back in the history books, you might remember the tagline at UK, I think this was before Sea Blue, of dream, challenge, succeed. I went to my file and I found an old copy of the letterhead. Because I can't really give a retrospective, I'm gonna use this tagline in a modified way to focus my talk for you today on three things that I think you'll find really interesting. First, I'm gonna talk a little bit about my inspiration, an early project that fueled my movement into the analysis of antiquities. And then I'm gonna talk about some of our successes. These are things that have launched us in the national eye and have put us in the press and the media, and also have given us some opportunities that we wouldn't have had without those successes. And then I'm gonna finish this talk by telling you about some of our current challenges. And I hope that when you see these challenges and the progress that we've made, you'll leave this talk with a really optimistic view of what we think we're going to be able to do in the coming months and years. So let me start with inspiration. Looking back almost 2 decades now to the year 2000, and many of you I'm sure remember Y2K, a lot of the computing scare that happened around Y2K. And then shortly after, in 2001, we had the terrorist attack on our nation. It was in that slot that I was developing my reputation as someone who was interested in digital restoration. And a woman by the name of Cheryl Seacrest from Maryland found me using the internet, which in the year 2000 was something that was just emerging, if you can imagine that, and sent me a cold call letter that basically said, I'd love it if you could take a look at this letter I have and see if you could produce a digital restoration. I'd like to say that one of my students at the time, who is now on the Computer Science Advisory Board, Joanna Leo, now Joanna Leo Amos, worked with me on this project. And what we did is we took this 1-page letter and we tried to find a way to digitally restore it. And this letter, you know, at first blush looks like a pretty badly faded piece of scrap material you might find in the wastebasket. And at the outset, we didn't really know how we were going to solve this problem. But with Joanna's help and with the help of the community here at UK, a few professors actually in the College of Engineering, we were able to find a way to pull the text from the letter. And given that foothold, we developed a method, not unlike the software pipeline I'll talk about in a minute, where we went through stages and developed a complete restoration of this letter. What really caught me off guard about this project and what provided for me the inspiration was the content of the letter, the narrative. You start to read and you realize, well, this is a letter from Cheryl's father, and he was in the war. He was in the Pacific theater of World War II. He was on a landing ship tank in the Pacific Ocean when he wrote this letter. It starts out, hello, my little darling, how are you this evening? Fine, I hope. Only readable because of the restoration that we did. Well, for those of you who know the history, landing ship tank is, they were the workhorses of the war, but a lot of the guys who were on these boats called them large, slow targets. And they weren't maneuverable. They were meant to bring heavy material to various theaters of war. And it was not sure whether Frank was going to get home from the war when he wrote this letter. And as you read the text, I think apropos for our season now, he said to his daughter, he said, just think Before long, you will enjoy your first Christmas. I only wish I could be there to see you get your first Christmas gift. And then he goes on, even though I can't, I will certainly be there in spirit. And he finishes, and you have to realize Frank is on an LST in the middle of the Pacific, and he's looking at the ocean. But what he can think of is the phrase oceans of love for his beautiful daughter, Cheryl. And, you know, who cannot be moved, right, by this narrative? And Cheryl didn't tell me when she engaged me on this project what the story was. I didn't know if her dad came home. I knew that she cherished this letter and that by displaying it, it had become badly faded and she wanted me to restore it, and that's what we did. So premised on that note of inspiration, which drove me farther into the idea of virtual unwrapping and digital restoration, I want to talk a little bit about our successes so that you can get the flavor of what, from that point onward, we were able to do with some really iconic and wonderful materials. In the late 90s and early 2000s, while I was doing that project, we were also working at the British Museum, the British Library, and at the Biblioteca Nazionale di Napoli, which is my terrible way of saying the library in Naples, which is the place that holds all of the material from Herculaneum. I was conceiving at the time, and with my research team, this idea of virtual unwrapping, where on the left you see physical unwrapping and the damage that it does, and on the right you see our conception of how we might do virtual unwrapping. We did some experiments, and these early successes helped us open the door to be able to get access to real material. What you're seeing here is the virtual unwrapping of an item that I made in the lab and then scanned at the University of Kentucky's Medical Center. Using the scanner in the basement of the medical center, which was the computed tomography scanner for healthcare, I was able to make a data set of this written material and then apply the entire software pipeline to that data set to generate a readable version without ever opening up the thing that we made in the lab. So this premise of being able to do virtual unwrapping, formulating this as a problem-solving exercise by identifying all the stages of virtual unwrapping and putting them together into a software pipeline, brought me eventually to the point where I was able to, through the gracious help of Penina Shore, the director of the Dead Sea Scroll Project at the Israel Antiquities Authority in Jerusalem. Through her graciousness, we were able to partner together and work on a real scroll that presented a huge problem. This scroll from the collection at the Israel Antiquities Authority was too badly damaged to be able to be opened. And Penina had no idea what might be done to be able to solve the problem, but she knew about the work that we had done in virtual unwrapping and was willing to take a chance on letting us look at the data. You have to understand that aspects of this work rely on partnerships to be able to allow us to have the access and to have the partnership to acquire data on a real object and then play with that data. So Penina believed in us, and she believed in the idea of virtual unwrapping, at least to the degree that she told me, well, it's a shot in the dark, but take your chance. So she gave me, on that day, a disk drive that was full of computed tomography data around a scroll that she had in her collection that had been excavated in the, on the western shore of the Dead Sea near an iconic town by the name of En-Gedi. En-Gedi sits right on the Dead Sea. As you look to the east, you can see Jordan on the other side. And you can also see that the national park, which is in the foreground here, is set up so that you can actually visit the archaeological site where this scroll was discovered. And if you go even today to this archaeological site, you'll find many artifacts were discovered at the town of En-Gedi on the shore of the Dead Sea. including this beautiful mosaic floor and the remains of what certainly was a Jewish synagogue from the Byzantine era. In the floor of that temple, marked here with marker number 8, you find the location of the Holy Ark, the Ark where the sacred documents for the synagogue were stored. And when that Ark was excavated, that is when the scroll and many other remains were found. That happened in 1970. And the scroll, and I'm holding a replica of it here so that you can see the actual size is just remarkably small. It fits in the palm of your hand. This replica gives you the exact scale of the size of this small artifact. The scroll sat in a collection since 1970 until Panina took the initiative to make the scan and then give us the data. This computed tomography scan at a very high resolution revealed all of the interior structure of this scroll, giving us a real shot at applying virtual unwrapping, basically being able to read whatever was inside without having to physically open this scroll. You can see this cross section, which is often the way that people look at computed tomography, is that they look at it in slices, even though if you put the slices together, you get a representation of the interior structure that's basically three-dimensional. You can see in the cross section a lot of really interesting structure. And I have to tell you that, and maybe this is something the alumni community can be proud of on my behalf, I'm probably the world's foremost expert at being able to look at X-ray slices of damaged documents. And I've learned in my career that if you can make your area of expertise be narrow enough, you can be the world leader. So here you see animal skin, and you can tell it's animal skin because looking at this cross section, you should be able to see some of the cellular structure and the bubbled up nature of what the heat did to the animal skin that was rolled up, which made the basis the underlying surface for the writing of the scroll. We were able to.
Virtual unwrapping begins by acquiring a three-dimensional volumetric scan.
Can you hear that
of the
audio?
manuscript.
I'm going to turn that down and narrate myself. We were able to do the virtual unwrapping from the data set from the beginning all the way to the end. This was a remarkable breakthrough, and it was the first time that virtual unwrapping had ever been applied to a real object to reveal a completely new text. This text turned out to be a known text, which I'll talk about in a minute. The technology that we used basically followed those steps of the virtual unwrapping pipeline exactly, where we took the data set, we found the layers and identified them using algorithms for segmentation. That is to localize and then build a surface around every one of the wraps. And then the next step, crucial, is a step we call texturing, which is that we paint onto that surface that we construct exactly what is represented in the scan that was taken, using a number of parameters that allow us to do that painting. The texturing followed by the flattening gives us finally a readable result, even though from the original data you really can't see anything. It's too convoluted and too difficult with both the geometry and the difficulty of the text itself to see if there's any writing or to be able to read it. What we did on the scroll is that we took each of the wraps, and there were about 5 or 6, independently unwrapped and flattened with the texturing from the original scan that was provided for us. And then we created this master image, this overall view, as if the scroll had been unwrapped physically, which is impossible. And you can see clearly on the surface of the representation there, the writing, the surface and the resolution of the surface was good enough that we were able to actually give this to scholars, and those biblical scholars were able to treat that image as if it were a photograph. And from that, they did biblical scholarship on the text, which actually turns out to be an early, almost the earliest known copy of the book of Leviticus. First part of the first chapter is the rightmost column here, and then it continues on the next column with the beginning of the second chapter. To put this into historical context, you can see on the timeline that the Dead Sea Scrolls come from a period right around the transition from into the Common Era. And you see that that corresponds about with the Second Temple period in Israel. And the scroll from En-Gedi is placed right around 300 CE, which is in the middle of this section of almost complete silence in terms of what we know about the biblical scholarship. For reference, medieval scholarships, medieval manuscripts typically sit up here in the 1000 CE range, the Middle Ages, and then the Renaissance. And so this period of silence was punctuated by our discovery of the text from the scroll from En-Gedi. Very, very few texts exist from that period. The paper that was published by Michael Siegel and Emmanuel Toph with us as co-authors that worked over the biblical scholarship was able to show that this text was a settled Masoretic text of Leviticus, pushing back the date at which they believe that text became a settled text more than 800 years. The Cairo Geniza was the earliest known settled copy before here. So huge success for us, positioned after many years with the software we had created for virtual unwrapping. We published and got, and had this paper appear in Science Advances to describe all of the technical part of what we did. And then we were very honored to find out that the New York Times picked up on its front page the image in their September 22nd edition. And so there you see that picture from the lab at the University of Kentucky on the front page of the New York Times. Ironically, if you read Leviticus, you find that it's about burnt offerings. And the opening verse of Leviticus 1 is the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him. You know, these are deeply sacred words for a number of people who, a number of folks worldwide who are Jewish, Christian, and venerate texts from the Old and New Testament. So, you know, just a huge, huge honor to be a part of this success and to do it here at the University of Kentucky with the support of the College of Engineering. So I'm going to finish my talk by premised on those successes by going through some challenges. And for this, I'll go back to Herculaneum, because what a collection. I mean, the literature from Herculaneum is unprecedented in the sense that that the scrolls that have been opened have revealed literary texts on really interesting topics that we would probably all agree, you know, are part of the definition of what it means to be human. You know, when you think about death, you think about poetry, about music, about piety. They were writing about these things in the ancient world. But here, this last bullet, hundreds of these scrolls still unopened, really? I mean, what an opportunity if virtual unwrapping can become a concern, an active solution to be able to think about not creating fragmentary works like this, which is what happens when you physically unwrap a scroll like those from Herculaneum, and not being able to create the wreckage like this, which Wordsworth actually wrote about. In his poem, September 1819, he wrote, "O ye who patiently explored the wreck of Herculaneum lore, what rapture could ye seize some Theban fragment or unroll one precious, tender-hearted scroll of pure Simonides?" Yeah, you can see that I'm all about that. Yeah, rapture is indeed, right? How many of us come to work every day and we think today we're going to find rapture in what we do? But I can tell you that the idea of reading a Herculaneum scroll brings with it, that possibility. Words almost 200 years old from Wordsworth, talking about other people and how they think about Herculaneum, and I feel the same way. So there are almost 1,000 scrolls in the collection. It has a solid provenience back to Herculaneum, so there's no question of the authenticity. There are many more that are likely to be excavated if they start excavation again. And in 2009, we had the opportunity to actually image a Herculaneum scroll, and you're seeing here what the interior structure of an intact Herculaneum scroll looks like. And for the first time in the history of the world, we were able to show this. We collected the data in 2009 from a Herculaneum scroll. No one had ever seen the interior before. No one had ever seen the interior, and no one had ever seen this radiograph, which represents what a Herculaneum scroll looks like if you just take an X-ray. On the left, you see the tomography. And the machine we used to capture this was a commercially available machine that we had shipped so that we could do the work on site. I mean, it was an incredibly amazing experience to collect this data, but the acquisition, remember, in the virtual unwrapping pipeline, is just the beginning of a number of steps that are necessary in order to actually read anything. Here you see a close-up of what the interior of a Herculaneum scroll actually looks like, and you can only describe it as a wreck of Herculaneum lore. It's a mess. It's challenging. And when we came back from the scan, the Herald Leader wrote an article about our work. And if you Google my name with the word stymied, you can still find that article, because they wrote that I had not been able to progress in being able to actually read what we had scanned from the Herculaneum collection. And the article was accurate. We got back and found out that it was difficult to see what we wanted to see, that we were defying conventional wisdom. And as I hear the holiday music rolling, it reminds me of the line from the song Winter Wonderland, to face unafraid the plans that we've made. Yeah, there was a little bit of a fear after 2009 that I wasn't going to be able to actually solve this problem, and that not only would I have this personal unrequited challenge in my professional career, I'd also just have rapture dangling that close to me and perhaps never be able to realize that. Conventional wisdom, of course, was that you weren't going to be able to read Herculaneum because you needed to have a certain chemistry around the ink. And the other wisdom was that if you were able to read a scroll like we did for Engedi, it probably would be a fluke. There would be no systematic approach to the work that I was trying to make systematic. This conventional wisdom said that carbon ink, which much of the ancient world uses, would be completely invisible with tomography. And maybe not conventional wisdom, but who really cares, especially about Leviticus? Why couldn't it be Genesis? A more general way of expressing this kind of humorous point is that if you end up with an artifact that has inside it something that's a shopping list or wasn't that interesting from the ancient world, why should anybody care? And those things can be, those conventional wisdoms that say that you can't do something can be a little bit debilitating and demotivating. But what I want to show you is that as we began to meet this challenge, we came into the ability to refine the pipeline, the virtual unwrapping pipeline, and we kept plugging away at various artifacts that came our way through our tireless effort at trying to apply virtual unwrapping to really interesting materials. What you're seeing here is a manuscript that cannot be opened because these pages are fused together. On the left-hand side, you see one quire that is detached. A quire is part of the way that it's organized in terms of its binding. And that detached quire is the only part of this thing that can now be turned as a book. This is actually a copy a very early copy of the Acts of the Apostles, acquired by the Morgan Library in New York City and written in Coptic. We were able to acquire a complete scan of this. And you can see in the tomography what the pages look like. These animal skin pages, tantalizing us with the ability to apply virtual unwrapping and read what's on the page. I want to show you what that data actually looks like at the binding and show you how miraculous the tomography is in terms of the detail. You're seeing a very high resolution scan here, and you can see each of the quires with the cord inside the quire and the binding clearly, the thread of the binding clearly visible. By applying the text on every one of those pages in the middle of that manuscript that cannot be opened, here is a section of the Acts of the Apostles from chapter 10, verses 4 through 6. And I told you at the beginning that Christina, my PhD student now, and one of our storied undergraduates, won the Best Paper Award. She won this award for work that she did in solving the unwrapping of this manuscript and bringing this text out so that the scholars can now analyze it. So where does that leave us with Herculaneum? I'm going to focus now just on the texturing problem. We're going to get a little bit technical, but that's because we're engineers, and I wouldn't be able to give a talk for engineering alumni if we didn't descend into a little bit of technical talk. So in this section of texturing, I want to talk about the carbon ink challenge. So on the left, you see a photograph of a piece of Herculaneum that shows a letter form. It's a lunate sigma. And on the right, what it looks like in tomography is absolutely nothing. You cannot see that carbon with your naked eye in the tomography, even though this tomography is very high resolution. What's going on here is that you have this surface on which there is ink, and you might even think that the ink is adds a little bit of a layer, so there's a little bit of a profile there. If the ink that's on that surface has a density that's a little bit different, like there's metal in it, then in the X-ray, you're going to see that density as two different brightnesses. And you might even see some kind of penetration done into the surface that the ink is painted on, where you have kind of a transition area between the ink and the pure substrate. But if the densities are not that different, what the tomography or the X-ray basically shows is all a unified intensity. So to your eye, when you look at this data, even though the ink is there, it's not invisible. In tomography, you can't see the difference. So the conventional wisdom that carbon ink was going to be the downfall of virtual unwrapping made me question some of our first principles. So yes, I went to the, don't tell my family, I did this on the kitchen countertop, but mixed up some ink and made some samples here on an index card with various characteristics. And this was our very first attempt, got more precise later, but took this to the scanner and created some scans. Here's what that card looks like edge on, and you can see in the places where I really gooped up the carbon, naturally you're going to see a profile. What I learned from doing this is that, of course, carbon ink is not invisible. It's not invisible at all. What I learned is that not seeing ink in the scan is not the same thing as saying there's no evidence of the ink in the scan. Okay? I think one of the big things that happened, and I guess this happened for us around 2014, 15 era, is that we started with some emerging principles around how to solve the ink problem that required us to look a little bit more carefully at the shape change that happens when ink is applied, at the resolution that we would need to capture to be able to see that shape change, and then add a new method that might help us get at all of those things. And that new method is deep learning. So let me give you an intuition for this. Let's think a little bit about food. Holidays are coming up. If you think about the surface of papyrus, which is the surface that the Herculaneum material is written on as a structure that looks kind of like a waffle. And just help you out here. Here's some fiber pattern from papyrus. And usually you have the fiber pattern actually goes in an orthogonal way. You have, 90 degrees opposed fiber structure with the two layers together giving you the strength of the page. If you take a look at that in really high resolution, you might be able to capture exactly what's happening on each of those fibers when it gets coated with something like carbon ink. What we had captured in Paris in 2009 was an image that looks like this in cross section. So this is the internal wrap. These are the internal wraps of papyrus in a Herculaneum scroll at 25 microns. But what we were able to capture last year at 8 microns looks like night and day between the two structures. Can you see how clear all of these ambiguous areas become when you have a much higher resolution capture from the tomography? So in addition to capturing new material at a much higher resolution, we also created a set of experimental methods using deep learning that allowed us a new pathway for being able to detect something like carbon ink, whereas before we didn't have that pathway. And I'm going to walk you through how this works. So this carbon phantom is constructed so that we have carbon ink in the large blobby characters, and we have iron gall ink written in the numbers. The dots are also iron gall ink, and by putting together this pattern as an image, we can compare it to what we get when we scan this item in the lab with tomography. And when I show you the comparison, you really can't see the carbon ink, but you can see all those dots very nicely. And you can see, especially this number 5, because it's written in iron gall. So with your naked eye, you can definitely see the evidence of the iron gall ink, but in this proxy, we have real difficulty seeing the evidence of the carbon ink. But we know it's there and we know how it's set up. So the experimental framework is to map this carbon-based phantom, which we have as a pattern, so we know where everything is, to map that through a chain that allows us to align exactly where we know the ink is all the way back to the original volume. This mapping or this linking of what is ink back to the original volume allows us to associate the ink in the final output with the scan area in the original input that produced that ink. Even though we can't see it with the naked eye, what we can do is create a set of labels where we know there's ink and where we know there's no ink. And from this matching between where we know there's ink here and the original scan, we can build a neural network that is able to optimize the ability to recognize whatever pattern is going on in this input area, and then generalize to areas that it has never seen before. Obviously, we do this for both the ink areas and the no ink areas. And by putting this neural network together, here is what we were able to detect in terms of evidence for ink in this phantom from the lab. The rightmost column has the most carbon. The leftmost column has the least carbon, down to column 1 where there was only one very thin application. By applying the machine learning based on the labels, we're able to make visible carbon ink that was not visible to the naked eye before we did the amplification. So here's the breakthrough. With deep learning, we were able to make the evidence of Herculaneum ink visible in CT scans. So great on a phantom in the lab, but what about real objects? Well, here's the triptych that shows you the original lunate sigma, the micro CT that shows no evidence, and then the application of that machine learning technique to be able to amplify the ink. And you can see that we amplify quite handily the ink that's available for us in that micro CT, but not visible to the naked eye. I want to show you some recent results. Maybe this can be a little bit interactive. It's tough on a webinar. I'm finding out that I'm actually better as a professor than I am as an actor, which this feels like more like a television show, but I'm going to ask for you to take a look at the left-hand side of this data set, which is a small fragment from Herculaneum that we scanned at very high resolution. And we trained a neural network on the ink that's visible on the left-hand side. And then we ran that neural network as a classifier on the right-hand side. Hadn't seen the ink on the right. The classification should show us some evidence of ink if there is some on the right. And I'm showing you this alpha, it's Greek alpha, just to give you a clue that you're looking for a Greek letter. It's not going to be alpha, and it's going to be about this scale. This is the training process and the classification process shown as a video. You should be able to see a letter form on the right-hand side that appears in doing the classification from the machine learning. Sometimes when it's a large format, it's a little hard to see. So in thumbnail, give everybody a chance to take that in. This is an unpublished result. We're working on the auxiliary results to go with this to publish. The photograph and the mask that shows us the labels. So what you can see here is an omega, last letter of the Greek alphabet, lowercase, and it's becoming visible in the tomography through machine learning at high resolution, something which was thought to be impossible. Okay, so I want to finish by saying we're actively pursuing the application of these techniques to Herculaneum material. Last fall, we were in the lab at the Diamond light source in Oxford with real Herculaneum material. You can see this fragment from Paris being set up for scanning. And having collected that data, we now believe that we have what we need to be able to apply virtual unwrapping all the way through to a Herculaneum scroll. We're actively pursuing this. It's exciting. And the data is incredibly interesting and complicated. You take a look at this center part of the scroll, and then I give you the entire cross section rendered more artistically than as data. And you can see that there's really interesting stuff here in terms of the geometry. We can only imagine what the text is. If I take the cross section in the other direction, you can see how interesting and convoluted and complicated are the wraps of this scroll. I'm going to finish now by saying to you that in the surprise of all of our development in making ink visible, we found that there's a deep learning surprise maybe waiting for us in terms of how we make that ink visible. It may in fact be possible to make the ink as good as a photograph. Instead of seeing X-ray, we might be able to make the ink appear as if we were able to take a photograph. And let me show you that. The machine learning that I identified for you matches the ink that we have in known locations to the scan inputs that generate that ink. But what if we used, rather than an ink, no ink label, what if we just used a photograph and said, well, this is how the color should appear if we see this input in the tomography. And this is how the color should appear if we see this input. What happens if we train that network on the appearance rather than the label that says ink, no ink? Here's what we get. We can take that carbon phantom and we can render from the tomography alone what looks like a photorealistic picture from the tomography alone. So you're not looking now at a picture that looks like X-ray. In fact, let me show you the side by side. This is the photograph on the top of the phantom, and this is the rendered result on the bottom, which comes only from the tomography, having been trained on the appearance matched up with what's in the tomography. We think this is pretty exciting, and so we tried it on the Morgan manuscript, which was the data we had readily available, where we have an original photograph and we have the ink from the tomography. Now, virtual unwrapping would say, this is what you give the scholar, and we hope you can read what's in that X-ray view. But with the kind of training I'm talking about now, the deep learning surprise, if you will, we can actually provide the scholar with the image you're seeing on the right, a color rendering that's photorealistic from deep learning that has matched up all of the appearance with the tomography and then is applied to parts of the manuscript that you can photograph in no possible way. So we have inspiration, we have success. I talked to you about the challenge. We think we're on the edge of really exciting stuff. One of the reasons I'm excited to continue here at the University of Kentucky is because it's a great place to be able to do this work. We have lots of plans. I want to complete the story for you here at the end. I told you part of my inspiration was from Cheryl and the letter from her father. I didn't know when I did the work what the end of the story was. He did come back. He came back from the war. They had many Christmases together, and he actually became a postman, delivering many other letters to many other people. This was the one that inspired me. All right, I'd like to say thank you to Dean Rudy, the College of Engineering, and to all of you UK alumni for supporting our work. It's a great honor to be able to give this talk, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Great, thank you, Brent. That was an outstanding talk. Very impressive and very impactful research. That's just great. I'd like to take a few questions, remind people that you can enter your questions in the Q&A menu or the button you see at the bottom of your screen. But I'll start off with one that Stephen Hughes had entered in the chat, and I think you had addressed it, but let me bring it up again, Brent. Stephen had asked if neural processing or probabilistic machine learning has been used in the segmentation process. And then he makes a note that he asked right before you started talking about deep learning in the process. But maybe you can talk a little bit more about the advanced CS techniques that you brought to bear on this.
Sure. Yeah, the segmentation, which is a precursor to the unwrapping, is tricky and a really important part of the process. And yes, we are using machine learning by training a region growing algorithm that says, okay, give me one section that you know is on the surface. And then we use machine learning to add to that surface or grow that surface through the volume by querying the neural network as to whether we should add a new point or not. And the neural network, the convolutional neural network, is very good at being trained to know when we should add points and extend the surface and when we should not. So we haven't fully deployed that yet, but once we do, we think that we're going to be able to segment automatically and en masse lots of layers from lots of scrolls, which will give us a huge at-scale collection. And that's going to be really exciting.
Yeah, very neat. Terry Keys asked a question as well. Will you be able to see the quote unquote crumbs of the scrolls that someone attempted to open to yield some readable text? In other words, can you scan those and then recombine everything into a whole page, like put the puzzle back together?
We're not sure about the degree to which we can reassemble. We've been doing some work with the Israel Antiquities Authority on exactly that problem, because they've given us access to a number of fragments from Qumran that are the size of fingernails up to the palm of your hand. And most of those are in an unknown order. So we actually do think that from the shape of the fragments, but also from the text on the fragments, most of which you can't see, right? Because it's in multiple layers, but virtual unwrapping can reveal it. We think that from that, we do actually have a really good shot at putting some things back together.
Right. So Ann Gibbons asked, other than the Herculaneum scrolls, what else are you working on? And when are you planning to submit your results for publication here?
Well, we've got the Morgan 910 well along, and we're working with scholars who understand the text. We're hoping to co-release that work because it's a really early copy of Acts in Coptic. So there's a lot there. We also have all of the Herculaneum data that we collected at Diamond. And so that's all in process, and we're hoping that it'll be ready for publication sometime in the middle of next year. And then we also have some things we can't quite talk about yet that are very exciting. And The timeline is all dependent on things outside our control at this point.
Mhm.
So, Kentucky governors, as well as diseases that we don't control, but still a really exciting period.
Yeah. And I want to ask a question. You probably know what motivates this question, but when you adapt this approach to other types of artifacts, not necessarily scrolls, but ones that may have a little bit more richness in terms of the photographs. I mean, it was really neat to see how you essentially render a photograph from the CT data. So can you do that on a more complex object that may have different appearances in different parts of it? How adaptable is this this approach of yours?
Yeah, we think that, I can't say it's infinitely adaptable, but given other work in other areas using the neural network to capture incredible nonlinearities and richness, right? We think we're limited right now only by the ability to build the network, which is to say, create the relationships between the data that have to be linked up. Once the network's built, that's where you get all the ability to do the classification. So I think that we're only scratching the surface on the kinds of problems that can benefit from a solution like this. And that's why it's so important, John, to keep the experimental part going and to build the labs that we want to build here at University of Kentucky so that we can capture the data, build those networks, and show what's possible.
Great. There are a couple other questions that have come in. Oh, a few actually. Good. So Mary Kelly writes, do you have a laboratory here on campus where you do some of your research? Somewhere where one could observe?
We do have a lab, and it's one that we're actively growing, and we work in partnership as well. For example, with John, and the equipment that just appeared in his lab, which we're a part of, will be equipment that we use. So yes, it's possible to come and see what we do have, but I'd like to say that we're excited about the growth that's going to be happening in our laboratory environment over the next few years. And it will allow us to do much of the work I talked about right here on campus, as opposed to doing it, most of the work we did experimentally on the thing I talked about today. The things I talked about today were done in other labs, and then we use the data here. So,
yeah, absolutely. Hannah Hatch asked, with the advancements in machine learning, does this put you closer to being able to put this software in the hands of scholars so that they can see their own works instead of having to wait for someone else?
Hi, Hannah. Hannah worked with me and was funded on the Women in Philanthropy project that we did. Another one of our outstanding students. So yeah, to answer your question, Hannah, we're releasing our code as open source, and we're building a consortium that can help build a user community. Doesn't have to be an expert in computer science, but can take the open source project, get it to run on a machine, and then absolutely apply it to the data they have, so that we don't have to be the bottleneck. And we understand that that's the way to go to scale for virtual unwrapping, is to give the software we've produced to the hands of as many people who would like to use it as possible, and then have them apply it to their own objects.
Mm-hmm. So Terry Keys has another question. Would your techniques be able to discern text that has been water damaged where the inks have run?
Water damage is a really interesting question. There's still evidence of ink even when it's been damaged through fire or water. And so it all depends on sensitivity and ability of the acquisition process to capture that evidence. So I'm not sure without knowing the specifics, but whenever things have been applied and then have been erased or effaced or damaged, there's always some evidence that's left. And it's just a question of sensitivity and technique as far as pulling it back out.
Sure. So here's an interesting question. Do the US Treasury or Bank of England or other similar institutions that attempt to redeem or replace burned currency use similar technology? Or have any of them expressed interest in your technology and algorithms?
I haven't gotten interest from them, and I'm not aware as to whether they use similar technology. So, if anybody in this group knows of work that I'm not aware of, shoot me a note, because we're always looking to understand what people are doing and how it relates to what it is we're doing.
So Reese Terry asked, how many of the hundreds of Dead Sea Scrolls remain to be read with this technique?
It's hard to count how many there actually are, because they're broken, and some of them were only partially unrolled. It got too hard and they stopped. But I believe it's fair to say from our assessment, because we've been in Naples and we've looked over the collection, there are several hundred full chunks that are either completely intact or partially unrolled that remain to be read.
So I had another question related to the one that Terry Keys just asked. So what sort of damage is too much? When is a scroll or some other artifact undecipherable using your approach? Or have you run into any dead ends where you can't make it work?
That's a good question. Let me just go back to Reese's question and make sure I say that in terms of the Dead Sea Scroll collection, not Herculaneum, there are hundreds of fragments that haven't been read, and some of them are substantial. And those are biblical, those are known to be biblical texts. So there's a lot there. As far as how much is too much, we have had a few projects where it was too much and we weren't able to extract any information. Really hard to know from the exterior what's going on inside.
Mm-hmm.
And so the more analysis you can do, the more predictability we'll have. But can't judge a book by its cover. You have to open the pages to see what's going on. And tomography allows us to do that, and virtual unwrapping allows us to turn the pages. So
I like that. You can't judge a book by its cover. Nice way to wrap that up. And I see we're actually at the end of our hour, and I think you've addressed all the questions. Thanks again for an outstanding talk, Brent. I enjoyed it, and I'm sure everyone else did too. Thank you.
Thank you.